guys, it's Sam, and today I want to talk about some of my favorite finales of all time. So someone asked for this, I think either on Instagram or on a YouTube comment, I'm forgetting which. I think when I was talking about a book that's going to be on this list as one of my favorite finales, someone asked if I could do a video about all my favorites. So here we go. I do frequently talk about finales being really disappointing for me. It is hard for me to find a finale that I truly love. I usually go in expecting to be disappointed, but these are finales that I feel like actually hit the target for me. So what I like in a finale is for all the threads, for the most part, to be wrapped up. I'm okay with a little bit of like bittersweet, maybe not having like everything completely wrapped up in a pretty package. Like the package doesn't have to be pretty in which it is wrapped in, but I do want some kind of completeness to the arcs, unless there is going to be like a continuation series, but I kind of get a little angry about that. Anyway, I also like there to be some kind of hardship, mostly because I am talking about like sci-fi and fantasy books, but if the characters don't go through some kind of loss in some way, whether it's the loss of some kind of character, whether it's the loss of some kind of like ideal, whatever, especially when most of these books revolve around like apocalyptic world-ending events, typically speaking, in these big series, I kind of don't believe it when like everyone ends up okay, and I also get really bitter when like everyone ends up okay and like all dating. So you're not probably going to see any of that in this list. The first book I want to talk about, which is actually one of my most surprising ones, is A Conjuring of Light by V.E. Schwab. This is one that actually kind of like annoys me that I do love it so much, because I did not like this series. I was never going to read this last book, but I was a judge in the BookTube SFF Awards the year that this book was nominated, so I had to read the entire series. The previous year I read the second book and hated it. I did not like the first book. It was just like okay for me, but I didn't plan to continue the series, but I felt like the final book was satisfying. It's a weird finale for me because I don't love the main character of like Delilah Bard. In fact, she makes my blood boil. But I do feel like all the characters did go through like satisfying arcs, and I think what made this more redeemable for me was that you had more characters that they're focusing on instead of just Kel and Lila, who are the two mains that we've had through most of the story. And we got more of Rye, who was one of the other, like, he's more of a side character and he got pulled in almost as a main character. And then we also got some stuff from like the villains, antagonist type characters as well. So this just felt more fully fleshed out and ended up being a really satisfying conclusion for me, even though the rest of the series was not satisfying. But I do have to include it because it was a good finale. Then we have Dark Dawn by Jay Kristoff. This is the last book in the Nevernight series, and again, this just kind of fits everything for me. There were parts about this book that I do have a review for it, so I'll link it on the screen. There were parts that felt like a little too easy for the main character at times, but the reason I put this on here is because regardless, I still was really satisfied by this, because by the time we got to this book, our main character had gone through so much that when she was able to bypass certain struggles fairly quickly, I was like, you know what, that makes sense. I compare it to like playing a video game like Skyrim, for example, and your character being the Dragonborn, and other characters being like, you can't do this, and you're like, I'm the fucking Dragonborn. That is basically how I felt about this. I was like, okay, in other books, would she have maybe struggled a bit more? Yes. But am I okay with her not? Yes. And this, for me, I felt like was a satisfying conclusion. I know some people didn't feel like it was, but for me, I felt like everything the characters got was earned in some way, even though I feel like there were things that could have been tweaked a bit. This is why it's like kind of farther down the list, but I felt like some things could have been tweaked slightly, but I was still very satisfied with this ending. It felt like a fully fleshed out arc for all the characters, all the growth, where they came from at the beginning, and just like the missions they set out to do and everything wrapped up really well for me. Then we have more of a fun one, and that is Ignite Me by Tahada Mafi. Yes, this series has since continued, but I still consider the original trilogy to be its own compact thing, and therefore this being a finale book. This book I've read years ago, and I don't remember much of the content of it anymore anyway, but it did feel so satisfying to me when I read it. I did go into this series for the romance, and for the hate to love romance, so that whole aspect of it was satisfying. Was the world building and all of that really that satisfying? No, because I didn't care about any of that. Like, I was not reading the series for the dystopian world that we had in this universe. Absolutely not. But the romance stuff in here was top-notch. I read this, I think, in like 1 or 2 sittings. It was so good. So this was one of my favorite YA, more fun finales. Then we have another series that I didn't love the entirety of, but I did end up loving the conclusion, and that is Clockwork Princess by Cassandra Clare. This is the last book in the Infernal Devices series. And again, this was one that I went into specifically for the love triangle. I also wanted the historical setting, and the rest of the series was kind of like, the first book was the second book I liked a little bit more, and this last book I really enjoyed. Again, the plot, don't really care about. the, you know, all of that. I was really just here for the character interactions, and the character interactions in here are so satisfying. There is loss, but there's hope, and it's just like, ugh, it's just gut-wrenching. But I think this conclusion is just like so good and so like just perfectly wrapped up. The epilogue in here is obviously top-notch for people that have read it. It's so good. And yes, is there an element of like everything kind of working out in a way, but it works out with like a lot of obstacles in the way and a lot of angst first. So it feels very earned for the characters. Then we have The Magician's Land by Lev Grossman. This is the final book in the Magician's trilogy, which is a contemporary fantasy. And this finale was just so good. As far as the wrapping up of arcs and everything, so complete, top-notch. There's so many things that tie it back to the first book, which I love when series do that, and you're just like, the things that I thought didn't matter in book one, because I didn't like book one. I think book one I gave like 2 stars, but everyone that has ever read it was like, listen, you just have to push through. It makes more sense later. The first book is not that fun to read, and it's not. But then when you get to this book, you're like, all that stuff that I thought was like so stupid and so boring makes sense now in a completed, broad, fully fleshed out, complex story. It's so good. So this was just like very satisfying. Like so many of the arcs came around. I feel like the characters learned throughout the series. There was loss throughout the series. There was just like self-actualization of some of the characters. Like it's just so good. So this is actually a series that I would love to reread at some point. And I don't say that very often. I don't know if I'd reread the first book, but I probably would, so that I would have all the connections again. But this finale was just great. A great wrap-up of the series. Then we have The Beauty of Darkness by Mary E. Pearson. Again, one of the few YA finales that I do actually enjoy. This, again, just felt like everything was fully fleshed out. There is an element of, again, I feel like YA finales do this so much more, an element of there being like things that work out kind of perfectly for a lot of them, but again, this had an element of loss to it, and that they went through so much hardship to get to where they were. And especially with our main character of Leah, she just like goes through so much and evolves so much as a character and matures so much throughout the story that by the time I got here, I was like, oh, you're like a full adult and I just love you. So this was, I mean, it's tabbed up. I just adored this series and this finale just as a nice conclusion for everything. Then we have The Hero of Ages, which is book 3 in the original Mistborn trilogy. This is everything. I mean, there's so many reveals within this book that are just like so mind-blowing. And again, there's so much, there is loss, there is just things that, again, blow your mind, and things that you thought you knew from the first book that get turned on their head. This book is so different from the first book in the series, and so many people like the first book in the series a lot, and then struggle because the second book seems like a turn from that. But this is one of those books that just kind of wraps everything together, and also is why I just really like the Mistborn world, and why I'm going to continue to read the series within that Mistborn specific world, because it's just, it's so good. And like the lore there and everything, and just like the ending of this, I mean, this series just kind of takes what you think you know and twists it around. And I love it so much. Then when it comes to gut punches, we have The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the 3rd book in the Broken Earth trilogy. And again, the whole series is just a tearing or ripping out of your heart in a lot of ways, but we follow our main character through so much pain and hardship and transformation and just struggle, but also perseverance. And the ending is just so complete and, again, earned. There is a lot of loss. I mean, this is a post-apocalyptic fantasy story with a lot of themes of oppression and just horrible things that happen in here, but like, oh, what the characters go through and how they end up is just like very satisfying. It's sad at times, but it's still like, I definitely feel like our main character like ascends almost. Like she just breaks the bonds that have just kept her so down throughout the whole series, and by the end has like, she's like a phoenix. Like I get like so in my feelings with this series, but this last final book was so good, and this whole series blows me away. And my favorite finale to date that I've already talked about a lot this year already is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. This is the 3rd and final book in the Winter Night trilogy. This is absolute perfection in every single way. This wraps up all the arcs. This pulls in every single book and themes and elements for every single book, and everything the characters go through and that our main character goes through. She just becomes, again, similar to what I said about the main character in Broken Earth, she like evolves completely and like transcends all of her earthly bounds, especially this character, because she becomes like this bond between like the magical world and like the human world in a way, you know, and it's so good. And like there's things with like the romance that are also really cool as far as like the arc of that. Just all the themes in here about magic and about like religion and about history and humanity. I mean, I can gush forever, and I have already because I've done a full review for this book, but this finale is like it is the most satisfying thing I've ever read. I didn't have a single issue with this book. I didn't have anything that I'm like, oh, this could have been done better. No, this was perfect. This was perfect in every way. It had the loss, it had the success, it had the hope, it had the transformation, it had the completing of arcs, it had everything that I want in a finale, and it's perfect. So that is it for my favorite finales of all time. Comment down below, let me know some of your favorite finales and any that you might recommend to me, especially if you know of a series that I've started and haven't finished. Let me know what finales you think are like top notch, because that might motivate me to get those off my list first. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.